Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here this morning for our first breakfast of the 2025 season. We're grateful you all got out of bed bright and early this morning to come and spend a little time with us. I think we've got a pretty interesting talk today. I'm just going to make a few opening comments, and then I'll turn it over to Ryan to introduce our speaker today. For those of you who have been following the Liberty News, of course, you'll know that Chris is spending most of his time in D.C. these days. We haven't seen much of him since the announcement in November. He had about 170 people to hire and quite a series of meetings to get through, of course, before the whole confirmation exercise. That is rapidly getting to the end. Chris's confirmation hearing will be tomorrow, barring any changes. And so if you're interested, I'm sure there'll be some interesting back and forth dialogue at that. It'll be live streamed, and so you can find that online if you're interested in spending a couple of hours watching that. Once he gets through that process, then I think official confirmation will happen sometime next week, maybe as soon as Monday afternoon after the inauguration, but we'll see. Anyway, we're cheering for Chris from afar and excited to see what will come of that. I wanted also to share just a little bit before we started our talk today. My sister lives in Nicaragua, and so over the holidays we spent a little bit of time down there. I don't know how many people here have traveled to Nicaragua, but it is the second poorest country in the Americas. Now, they have a grid there, of course. They have electricity that runs to most of the places. She lives in a small town called San Juan del Sur. It's on the Pacific coastline, maybe 15,000 people. And she has electricity that runs to her house, but she also has a roof full of solar panels and a big battery storage solution down in the basement. And the reason for that is the electricity's not on some meaningful amount of the time. We spent 5 nights at her house and then a little bit of time traveling, and of the 5 days we were there, the electricity went off for probably 6 or 7 hours, at least 3 of those days. And so if she didn't have solar panels and a battery solution, and of course she's lucky enough to be able to afford that there, most people cannot, you find yourself without power. Now, of course, even with that, that doesn't mean that everything in her house works. That's enough to keep the lights on, to keep the refrigerator running, and maybe a ceiling fan going for some period of time. But no hot water, no air conditioning, no laundry. None of those things will run on her suite of solar panels and battery pack. And so you do without a lot of stuff there when the power goes off. Now, of course, she's amongst the lucky few there that have that opportunity. Most people, when the power goes off, live in the darkness for however long that situation is. Now, that's Nicaragua. That's the second poorest country in the Americas. But we're going to talk about the grid here today and some of the challenges that we're facing. And it's unfortunate to see that we've been making policy decisions that have our grid going in a direction where we may find ourselves without power on for extended periods of the day. And so that's a little concerning to me, but I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to introduce our speaker. And again, thanks very much for being here this morning.
Well, good morning, and I want to first of all just thank everybody in the room for their response on relatively short notice to come join us today. Obviously, calendars have been around our shop have been in a little bit of state of upheaval since November. So, and to our team who put this together relatively quickly too. And then finally to Camilo, who has picked up the phone right before Christmas. The energy nerds that we are, we saw the long-term reliability assessment that NERC puts out annually come out on, I think it was December 17th. We're like, this would be perfect for Liberty and Energy. So Camilo Serna is with us today. He's come in from Detroit. He joined NERC just inside a year ago, I think, but has spent his career as an advisor to the utility sector and then also within a couple major utilities working on strategy and rate design. And so he's going to talk about this latest report that they've published. Hopefully we'll drill down a little bit onto some of our local issues. For some of you that may not know, in 2021, as a part of the many pieces of energy legislation that have been passed in our state, we're required to join an RTO by 2030. And so one of the likely candidates is Southwest Power Pool, which, as you'll see on these maps, does light up as having some elevated risks. So we'll maybe try to touch on that either in Q&A or in part of his remarks. So welcome Camilo to the stage, and again, thank him for joining us this morning.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good. Well, appreciate the invitation. Really a pleasure being here in Denver, Colorado. As I was telling some of you, a couple months ago, I was already here talking about some of the work that we do at NERC that I will explain today. So I do know Colorado, Denver has a very dynamic energy industry, so it is always important for us to really go and talk and explain what we're doing, but also get your feedback and get into a dialogue. So hopefully, as I present the materials, I present what we have to say, there is a lot of feedback and Q&A, or we can do it afterwards. I was also reflecting on Ron's point about Nicaragua. As you can tell, I have a little bit of an accent, so I'm from Colombia, and that's where I grew up. That's where I spent now most of my life has been here in the US, but I did grow up, was born and raised in Colombia, and we had an issue back in the 90s, early 90s, where we didn't have power. That was going on for like 8 months. The system, we rely a lot on hydro, and there was a big drought, so I remember there was every other day, I think, we didn't have power at night. So it was, actually it was interesting because you got to spend time with family, you did things that you didn't have to do or that you didn't do before, but it does speak about the importance of electricity and how critical it is, and sometimes we take for granted what it takes to keep the lights on. And that's something that we'll talk about, what we see in terms of the challenges to the electricity industry and what we see. But before I get into some of the details and kind of building on that theme is how critical electricity is to the economy, to North America. If you look at some of the statistics, back in the 50s, electricity was 4% share of the consumption of energy. So it was a very, very small element of the energy value chain. There were all the pieces. Back in 2023, it was 20%. And if you look at some of the statistics or some of the forecasts would indicate that electricity is going to be 50% of energy consumption, half. So we are going to be relying on the electricity sector more and more. Other way that we think about it, electricity is about 5% of the US economy, but we like to think about it that it is the first 5%. Really, without electricity, we are really going to have significant issues. But we also think about how we manage the electricity sector, at least at NERC, and we know that it is a balancing of priorities. We have desire to have affordable energy, reliable energy, and energy that meets certain environmental goals, clean energy goals. But it is really a balancing act between these three priorities, and at NERC, we take those into consideration as we do our work. We think about it, if you want a 100% affordable system, it's likely not going to be very clean. If you want a 100% reliable system, we would love that, but it's not going to be very affordable. We know that that's not where we can go. And if you want a 100% system, it's likely not going to be very reliable. So I think the key is that we need to balance along those three priorities, kind of be one versus the others. I'm going to speak about reliability because that's what we do and that's what we're mandated by Congress to focus on. So definitely just excuse me because I'm going to be putting a lot of emphasis on the reliability of the system. That's what we're here to do and to kind of advocate for the reliability of the electricity system. But we do understand that it's a balancing act, and we include that balancing act as we make decisions on some of the work that we do. So I'll talk about three things in my presentation. First, because I believe many of you really don't know what NERC is or how we do our work, what we're here to do. So I'll go a little bit into who NERC is, how we do our work, what is our mission, our vision. Then I'll cover in detail the long-term reliability assessment. That's when I get into some data, some charts, we'll give you some information, some statistics, and then I'll close it out with talking about the recommendations, where we do see the sector needs to work. And really, it's not just the electricity sector. We work with many other sectors, so we need the help from folks in the gas industry as well, but many other industries as well. So let's start. So NERC. If you go back to the history of NERC, NERC started back in the mid-'60s, and NERC is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. So starting in the 60s, there was a significant outage in the US, and the utility industry, the electric utility industry, decided to get together on a voluntary basis to start looking at how they could collaborate to ensure the reliability of the system. So it was a voluntary organization at the time. It wasn't, it didn't have the same nomenclature that we have today, but it started as a voluntary organization to share learnings in terms of how we were planning and designing the system, because that was one of the issues that drove that outage in the 60s. So the organization was on a voluntary form until we had the significant outage in 2003. Hopefully, or not hopefully, some of you might remember that outage in the Northeast, and it went all the way to Canada. That had significant implications, economic implications to the US. So in 2005, Congress established NERC through the Energy Policy Act. So established what it's called the Electric Reliability Organization, or the ERO. And NERC and the regional entities that we work with are the ERO. And our mission, our vision is very simple. It's to have a highly reliable and secure bulk power system. That's what we're here to do. The bulk power system, when we talk about bulk power system, that means the transmission system for the most part. Voltages 100 kV and above, and the generation units that connect to the transmission system. So that's our mandate, and our mission is to effectively and efficiently reduce the risks to the operations of the bulk power system. And we cover not only the US, but we also cover Canada. So we think of the services that we provide to be for 400 million customers that we have both in the US and Canada, and a slight sliver of Mexico there. So we do have some authority in Mexico as well. And as I indicated, we do it at NERC, which is the central organization, and the regional entities that you see there on the map. They are the ones that helps us with the compliance activities that I'll speak in a minute across the US and Canada. So that's what NERC is. So I mentioned that our mission is to effectively and efficiently reduce the risks to the system. So many of you, I believe, work at corporations. So think of us as a large enterprise risk management organization. So that's what we do, but we have a single focus on the security and reliability of the system. That's what we're here to do. So most of my remarks today are going to focus on the reliability. I don't want to dismiss by any chance the fact that we also focus on the security of the system. And we see significant challenges also to the security of the system, both from cyber and physical threats. So that could be another topic for discussion. I'm probably not the expert in the field, so happy to bring you someone from our security side of the house. But don't take away the fact that I'm only speaking about reliability, that we're also not paying significant attention to the security risks to the bulk power system. So as a risk management organization, how do we do our work? So basically, like any good risk management organization, first, you go about understanding, assessing, quantifying the risks that you see out there. How do we do that? We have situational awareness capabilities. We have a team that is monitoring the system real time, gathering information from all the regional entities. We're paying close attention, for example, to the cold weather snap, to the situation in California. So we have a team that is monitoring the system, understanding challenges that perhaps you might not see manifesting themselves into outages, but we see those close calls and gather information about those close calls. We conduct short-term, long-term reliability assessments. We evaluate events, incidents. We collect that information to inform what we're seeing in the system. And we also gather information on the security side, and that's where I mentioned we have the Electricity Information Sharing Analysis Center, the EISAC. And many industries have an ISAC. So we manage the ISAC for the electricity industry. So we gather all this information to identify, quantify the risks. Once we identify and qualify those risks, we develop mitigation plans, like any good risk management organization. And those take many different forms. We produce reports, we send alerts to the industry, We convene task forces, convene working groups, but the most significant of those is we develop mandatory enforceable standards. So any company that is connected to the transmission system, it's a registered entity within the NERC universe, and they need to abide by our standards. And then the regional entities across the US will go conduct audits on the registered entities, and if there are failings, they develop action plans, and if needed, there are penalties assessed to these registered entities that are not compliant with the standards. So that's the most significant tool, that's the stick that we have in our arsenal, but most of the work that we do is working with the industry to mitigate the risks that we see on a voluntary basis. A couple of other pieces that I will mention before I move into the assessment is the work that we do at NERC is significantly emphasizes collaboration. It's an industry stakeholder organization. The standards that we develop are voted by the industry. We have a very rigorous process on how we develop standards, but the industry meaning those that connect to the system, vote on the standards. So one of the features of our work is, although it might take time to develop a standard, once it gets filed to FERC, FERC is our entity that regulates us, there are no challenges. We haven't seen any legal challenge to any of our standards because of the beauty of the stakeholder process that we follow to develop those standards. The other piece I will highlight, we're an independent organization. We're not an arm of the government. We have an independent board of directors, focus a lot on facts, and we are mainly an engineering organization. So a few of us are allowed to work at NERC to provide the messaging, but we're mainly an engineering organization, and so I just wanted you to take that away. So let's now talk about the assessment, which is what I'm here to talk to you. So as I mentioned, we do assessments. That's one of the ways that we gather data to understand the situation in the system and how the system is doing. So the key kind of highlight of our assessments is what we call the long-term reliability assessment, LTRA. So we produce that report every year towards the end of the year, as Ryan indicated. We produced the last one, the 2024 in December. It's a 10-year forward look of the energy and capacity dynamics in the electric system, in the bulk power system. We assess the system across 20 different regions, as you can see in the map, and the slides, more than happy to share those. So this is all public information. So I won't go through all the regional, all the different regions that we conduct the assessment. We work very closely with the regional entities, with the different stakeholders to collect the data. We focus on data that we can feel confident in using. We don't make assumptions on what might happen 10 years down the road with policy X or policy Y, or company action X, company action Y. We take announced retirements, for example. We take demand growth that we know for certain is going to happen in the system. And basically what we do is combine information on projected generator retirements and additions. We look at the demand growth. We look at transmission build out to assess the regions and understand, are they going to have risks related to the availability of electricity over the 10-year period? That's really what we do with our assessment. So before I get into some of the details, one of the pieces I did want to call out is how much weather impacts how we do our assessments. And weather has always been a critical element of our assessments. Ensuring that the system can operate under extreme weather circumstances is critical to any planning. I talk about the situation in Colombia. A drought, they didn't have power. I think that's the same thing that might be happening in other countries. I know it's happening in South America today as we speak. But in the past, the weather patterns were more easily planned because you have base load generation, whether it be coal, nuclear, gas, enclosed in a power plant. So you only worried about how the weather was impacting the demand in the system and spikes on demand. But today, as we think about the system and how we plan for the system, we need to think about different type of weather events, and that's really adding to the complexity of ensuring that the lights stay on. So let me start with the chart on the right-hand side. I don't expect you to follow all the colors, but I'll make the key point here. So back in 2022, in the winter of 2022, we had a significant weather event in the eastern seaboard of the US. So I don't know if you all recall a storm that we call Elliott. I was working at a utility at the time. I remember 24th of December, getting up in the morning, seeing the situation and beginning to ask the questions, do we need to invoke the protocols to start cutting out power to our customers? Who do I need to call because I handle regulatory relationships for the utility? So the situation that we had, it was a significant cold weather event. And the difference that we see today with cold weather events is that they are longer, they impact a broader region, and they are much, much more significant. And that's something, what you see there is in this particular instance, you have a region in the East Coast called PJM that covers a good section of the US. If you see in the pink, it's how much they export to their neighbors. And usually during the day, they are sending a lot of power to the southern neighbors in the East Coast. But you see there towards the afternoon, the pink is gone. PJM was having issues of their own. They have some issues with some of the generating units because of this cold weather event was impacting not only the south, but the northern east part of the US. So what you saw there is that that region couldn't export power that the other regions counted on in their planning before. So what you ended up happening is that you had outages in the Carolinas, Tennessee, and those were significant. And that's not what we want to see. That's not an element of a highly reliable system. So that's one, is that the weather events that we need to plan for are longer, deeper, and cover a much wider area. So we need to take that into account in our planning and in our assessments. On the right-hand side of the side is now that we have built so much renewables into the system, and we're planning to build, and I'll share with you some of the data, how much more renewables are going to be connected to the system. You need to account for new weather patterns in your planning. So what you have there on the left-hand side is there is a region all the way from Canada to Texas. That's the MISO region in the way that we look at the system, that basically has 60 gigawatts of installed wind capacity. So if you look at the number, you say, well, you're good. You have 60 gigawatts of wind. That's great. But there was a day in June of 2023, early June, that we had 300 megawatts running. There were no issues with the wind plants. They were operating. There was no wind. It's a wind drought. And now we need to account for those. So if a system is relying on 60 gigawatts of wind, that there are days of the year that's not going to show up. No matter what you do, it's not going to show up. You're going to have solar droughts as well. You need to plan a system to be able to carry through those days. Fortunately, it was early June, light load, and the system had plenty of capacity available. The way it's built, you have excess capacity. But if had that happen on a hot summer day, I don't know what would have happened in the system. So I think that's what we're going to get as we do the assessment. So I just wanted to color the assessments that we do, saying that the world has changed and we need to think about weather and the impact of weather to the electric system in a very different manner than what we did even 5-10 years ago. One, because of the type of weather events that we're seeing. Second, with the type of generation that we are including in the system, it's going to be more weather dependent. So let's talk about the assessment, which was the reason I was invited. It's a great effort. It's a detailed report. It's about 150 pages, goes through each one of the regions. So if you're interested, you can go into the details. I'll be happy to share the highlights of any of the regions of interest. Ryan gave me some of the key ones that you're paying attention as you look to connect to an RTO. But the key findings that I'll cover in detail is, one is the pace of retirements. We're concerned about the pace of retirements of base load generation. So that's number two. Sorry. First is that over half of North America is at risk of energy shortfalls over the next 10 years. So that's what I would call, we have a map that is blinking red, and that's the key takeaways. One of the drivers is the pace of retirements is significant. We also see the level of additions to the system is slowing down or is not meeting our expectations in terms of how fast new additions are coming into the system. Demand growth is picking up quite a bit, and that's adding to the challenges. And one of the things that you see, and I'll speak into the details, is we are relying more and more on the gas system to back the electric system. So that means that the reliability of the gas system is as critical as the reliability of the electric system. And we need to start thinking of the gas reliability in the same way that we think of the reliability of the electric sector. And finally, we do need transmission. Transmission development is picking up, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be, as we see significant siting and permitting challenges to the transmission sector. So let me unpack each of these 6 elements with some data, and then again, I'll come back to some of the recommendations that we highlighted in the report and that we highlight in any of the discussions that we have with policymakers. So the first one is, as I indicated, more than half of the US is at risk. So this is the key piece of the report. We started producing these maps about 8, 9 years ago. Blue is good, orange is not so good, and red obviously is not good. But 10 years ago, this was all blue. The map was all blue, so just to put a reference. The map has had a lot of orange and red over the last 3 to 4 years. And without significant action, we expect this to be the case. And the point with the map is it's calling out on red the areas of high risk. That means that there could be shortfalls during normal weather conditions. Yellow means elevated risk, that there could be shortfalls during extreme weather conditions. So I'll let you look at the map. As you see, MISO is the one that we call out in red. And that's primarily because of the pace of generation retirements is very, very large and problematic at MISO. And then we also called out British Columbia. I know that's outside of the US here, but for the first time, because of some limits that they have in importing power from WEC, or the western side of the US. So that's the critical piece. That doesn't mean that there is going to be shortfalls, but that the risk of those occurring is high or elevated, and we need to take action to mitigate those. Those are driven, as you see from the map. In some areas, is the generator retirements. As I indicated, MISO, PGM is another place where we do see significantly announced number of retirements. We see limited dispatchable generation in areas like SPP and the California areas, where we are adding a lot of renewables to the system, but we're not adding enough dispatchable generation. Gas, nuclear, obviously they're not going to add coal in California, but we're not adding dispatchable generation, and that's a critical issue. The demand growth is impacting a lot of areas. It's uneven, but it is impacting a lot of our areas, especially in the east side of the US, as well as in Texas. And we also, so the combination of all of these is what drives the color coding of the map. And that's an important element. So let me talk about each of some of these in more detail. So let's talk about the pace of retirements. The pace of retirements is large and problematic from our point of view. We have 78 gigawatts of announced planned retirements in North America over the next 10 years, and another 37 gigawatts that are announced. And again, I'll make the point that we look at data that it is firm. We're not speculating. We're not looking at what certain policies are going to do and how much more generation could retire. This is announced or additionally announced that we feel somewhat confident that are going to happen. So someone could argue, and that's some of the feedback that we get, is that we might be conservative in our estimates of the amount of retirements. But even with this amount of retirements, we have the issues that we show in the map before. What you see on the map on the right-hand side is when those issues begin to manifest in terms of reserve margins being compressed below the levels that we feel are appropriate. And you can see MISO, we start seeing that as soon as the next few years. but it is covering most of the U.S. But again, the pace of the announced and planned retirements is significant, especially because most of those are base load generation that provide huge amount of services to the industry. I'll speak about those in a minute. So that's one. Then let me talk about the additions. So we do have a rich amount of new additions planned in the system. We have 400 gigawatts in the queues, whether it be in tier 1, tier 2, we call it. That's kind of the most certain of the resources that we could see be added. So if you look at 2034, that's 400 gigawatts. But more than 80% of those are solar, wind, and batteries, which is great, but they don't have the characteristics that we need in the grid. And we've seen, when we looked at the data from 2023 to 2024, we saw that the pace of additions was slowing down. The chart on the right has the solar example, where we saw that the solar projections were at 14 gigawatts less than expected. So we're concerned that even with the issues that we have, and even if it is all renewable, the pace of additions is not keeping up. And that also creates some challenges and uncertainties as we look into the future. So what we see is that the new resource additions of wind and solar are helpful, but they are insufficient. And they bring the issue that I mentioned before of uncertain production. We don't know when they are going to produce. And in addition, we need to integrate all these inverter-based resources into the system. And there are a whole host of challenges in that space. We started seeing those issues 10 years ago. Inverters, the way they operate and integrate and connect to the grid is very different from a coal and a gas generator. And we're beginning to see a lot of quality issues in the system. So given all of that, now we're in the process, it's a 3-year process, we're in the middle of it, to really register all of those large inverter-based resources. So they are now going to be a registered entity within NERC, and will need to abide by a set of standards, because we need to ensure that anything that connects to the system maintains the reliability of the system. We might be having to have similar discussions when we talk about data centers or large loads as we connect, and they are kind of have similar operating characteristics. So again, the level of deployment is slowing down, and it is very much focused on renewables, which brings a whole host of challenges. On top of it, not that we have enough issues to contend, we talk about the weather, how the weather is changing. We have a generation mix that is changing, that is difficult to manage. On top of it all, we have demand growth that is accelerating. And this is really a more recent event. If you look at our growth forecast from 5 years ago, we had demand growing pretty much flat across North America. But now we see significant growth. You see on the chart on the left-hand side how every time that we've done our assessment, we've seen the demand growth increasing. From 23 to 24, we see the level of demand growth going from 9%. The 9% measures from the early part of from the first year of the assessment to the 10th year of the assessment. So demand was going to grow 9% in the 2023 assessment that we conducted. That's now almost double to 15%. It's huge. I mean, the electricity sector is a large piece, so growing that at 15% requires significant number of additions and to maintain the system reliability with all these additional challenges. So that's something. And one of the other pieces that I wanted to call out is that we see a lot of that demand growth impacting the winter. And so that's one of the issues, is that the winter peaks are increasing at a faster pace than the summer peaks. So the point there is managing through the winter, it's going to continue to be challenging for the electric sector. And that's also where you have less reliance on some of these renewables, because that's where the weather has significant impacts. And the other piece I would mention is not only data center that we see impacting the growth. We have electrification trends, and the other one that we do see is manufacturing. We have significant policies here to bring manufacturing into the US, and that's impacting the level of demand growth. Again, we want the demand growth, that's good, but we need to be able to manage through it, and we need to be very careful in how we manage that demand growth. So that's what's happening on the demand side. Let me talk a bit about the gas. And as I mentioned before, as we see all these trends playing out, with more renewables in the system, this large set of retirements of coal and nuclear, what's happening with the system is that we're going to and will continue to rely more and more on the gas system. So just to give you a few statistics, 20 years ago, only 20 years ago, natural gas generation only accounted for about 15% of the total generation in North America. Today, that's 40%. And obviously, that's the shale gas revolution. Many of you I know work in that space. It's great, and it's also helped with affordability. But that means that now we rely on the gas generation for 40% and probably going higher over time. The share of dispatchable generation that is coming from the gas is now about 55%. So that's when we really need the generation. We're counting on the gas system even more. And during the winter time, if you look at the table here on the right-hand side, some regions of the U.S., that dependency on the gas system is even more pronounced. You get to regions like in California, you have an 80% there. Sorry, in Florida, California, some regions also depend a lot on the gas. So the point is, as I indicated, winter becoming a critical element. In the winter is when we really in some regions depend on the gas system. But the gas system not always performs as we expect in the electric industry. Going back to the winter storm Elliott that I was referring before, the big event that we had in the eastern seaboard, one of the issues that we saw there is that cold temperatures drove many unplanned outages in the system, and many of those were driven by major declines in production in the Marcellus and Utica shales, and issues that we saw on the pipelines. So the gas production declined, the pressures on the pipelines declined, and obviously you were serving other customers that have firm contracts, which is the way that the natural gas industry works. But this generated about 20% of the unplanned outages in the electric sector that led to the issues that I indicated with rolling blackouts in the Carolinas, in Tennessee. But the other piece that we were very close to losing gas to New York City because of all the issues that we had during that winter storm. So it was, we can bring someone from Con Ed here and they can explain to you how close they were to losing gas. And I cannot tell you how dramatic of an event would be losing gas to any major metropolitan city, let alone New York. We'd probably still be lighting up some of the gas furnaces there. So again, we see, and I'll talk more about what we see we need to do working with the natural gas industry. We see the industry making encouraging progress. We see voluntary commitments being made about sharing information, addressing some of the reliability challenges that we see, winterizing the production wellheads, but more needs to be done, especially as we continue to rely, and that's something that we want to work with the gas industry. I'll talk a bit more about some of our ideas in that space as I get to the recommendations. And lastly, on the trends from the report, transmission development is increasing. That's good news. We see the amount of planned or under construction transmission projects kicking into high gear, but I would say it's not even close to what we need in terms of creating the connection between regions to address some of the shortfalls or the potential shortfalls that we see. The type of projects that we see are mainly reliability. That's the green portion of the donut shape chart that we produce. Which is good, but again, more needs to be done. What we see here is we see a significant number of projects held up in the siting and permitting process. We have about 1,200 miles. That's a huge amount of projects that are being held up. So anything that can be done on permitting and siting will be great. Again, we're not an advocacy organization. We don't go to DC. We present our data. We inform policymakers, but we're not in the advocacy front. But we would tell anybody that wants to listen to us that we need infrastructure, transmission and gas pipeline infrastructure and natural gas storage. We need it in the system to counterbalance all the additions that we're having on the renewable side. So let me close out the last slide. This is going to be a bit more into the what we do and what we do believe from NERC, the industry and us should be doing. So we have 5 key recommendations from our assessment. The first one, you might not be surprised given what I've been speaking to date, is that we need to carefully manage generator deactivations. So the point there, as regional entities, states assess potential generator retirements, we need to conduct a reliability assessment and understand, does that generator retirement add to the risks to the particular region? And if so, let's talk about what are the tools that are at the disposal of the RTO, the state, to manage that deactivation. Keep it running longer, slow it, cancel it, whatever it is. But we need to assess the risks with these generator deactivations, and if needed, think differently about those. So that's the first one that we tell resource planners, market operators, and regulators. We need to carefully manage those deactivations. There is no way we can retire all that amount of generation without creating significant issues to the system. Second, and that's more for us working with the regional entities, we need to change the way we plan the system for reliability. And this goes back to my point about the weather events. In the past, the way the electric system plans for and creates the reserve margins, we look at the frequency of events. We have what we call a 1 in 10. So that means we plan the system to only have 1 day of outage over 10 years. That's great, but that's insufficient. As I mentioned, these weather events, one event could be very devastating for a particular region. So we need to look at the duration and the magnitude of the events. And we do see some regions, Texas, for example, in December, adopted a new reliability standard to look at those 3 planning parameters as they do their assessment, assess how much generation they need in the system. And that's something that we're working very closely with the regional entities, with the planning coordinators, to make sure that we change the way we plan for the system. The third one is we need to streamline the siting and permitting, and we need to remove the barriers for resource deployment. And I don't think I will go more into the details there, but that's obviously for the regulators and policymakers. Anything that can be done to remove those barriers, we're supportive. Again, we don't know all the specifics on the policy dynamics on those. We know that there was a bill in Washington over the last session that addressed some of those. Any effort in that space is going to be well received by us. The fourth one is we really need to implement a framework for addressing the reliability needs of an interconnected system. And that really gets into the gas discussion. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper, given that I know I have a gas audience here, or some of you work in the gas industry. So as I mentioned, we see the momentum, at least, and we're working very hard, and I was talking to someone at the table. We want to identify the right organizations within the gas industry to work on some of these issues. We need to look at the commercial practices to really recognize how the electric sector operates and how that interacts with the gas sector. If you think of, especially on the pipeline side, the gas pipelines are used to very certain demand from the gas LDCs, industrial customers, that can be planned in advance. The electric sector is operating very differently. When you think of all the renewables, they're coming in and out, they're kind of on a second-by-second basis, you're seeing significant changes. They ramp up, ramp down. So we need to figure out a way to marry the two so the electric sector can procure the gas when needed. Some of the issues that we've seen in some of the events is gas works on a daily nomination period and it's closed during the weekends. So the electric sector cannot nominate gas during the weekend. So that's one small example of the type of coordination that we need to bring between the two sectors. We need to figure out how we build more flexibility into the gas contracting space to accommodate what's happening on the electric sector. That's just the nature of the system, or how it's evolving. It's going to be very volatile as you have all these renewables into the system. On the other hand, on the electric side, we need to figure out how we incent generators, especially merchant generators, to enter into more firm contracts and not wait to the very end to try to see what gas is available, that's not going to work, and that's for the market operator, the market RTOs to figure out how we value reliability and ensure that those generators procure the gas and the fuel that's needed. We also need some stronger, we believe, performance guarantees into the contracts to ensure that those operate during certain weather conditions. We have those on the electric system. When we saw all the issues that we saw with the generators not being available, we've developed a whole suite of standards that the generators need to abide to meet certain extreme weather, cold weather characteristics. Obviously, the gas industry is different, doesn't have a NERC on the gas industry, but we need to build that perhaps into the contracts to ensure that the gas is going to be available at certain temperature settings, and that needs to be an expectation. And we also need the gas LDCs. Again, we all need to work to free up some gas, non-emergency gas, to allow for gas to flow to generators or other equipment. The other piece that I forgot to mention is not only that the electric system is relying a lot on the gas, but the gas system also relies on the electricity system during this, at any point in time. And we also need some better situational awareness where more timely information is shared between the industries, at least on the electric side, to know where there might be issues so there could be actions taken to prevent outages. So again, a lot of things that we could do. Happy to talk about those in the Q&A section. And the last point, this is where it gets more into the specifics of the electric system, is we need to deploy resources that provide what we in the industry call essential reliability services. Sometimes it takes for granted that this is a big machine that we have. The electric system is a big machine, and it has been built with inertia in mind. So you have gas, coal generation. The rotating engines that you have for those generating units generates frequency and voltage services that allow the system to operate at the frequency that we need. When we're adding so much renewables, those renewables don't produce the same level of reliability services. So we need other units to provide those. At some point, renewables might be able to be what we call in the industry grid-forming inverters, so they provide those services, but today they don't do so. And this was a service that was provided by default by having a gas or a coal unit. But now that we're retiring so many of those, we need to figure out a way to either compensate for those and ensure that we have the units that provide those services. So the point there is, it's not just about the capacity and the energy, but this is an engine that needs to work smoothly at a certain frequency and voltage level that we all work, at least in the electricity industry, to be sure that the lights don't flicker, that you don't have those frequency drops, because those create equipment damages and other major events. So those are the 5 things. Again, I think I'm on time to open it up for Q&A. Hopefully these cover what you were expecting. Happy to take to any place that you want the discussion, feedback, questions, but I will emphasize that hopefully that doesn't stop here with my remarks. Hopefully there is an opportunity to follow up, again, as we try to work with the gas industry and better understanding how we can work together. So with that, happy to take any question. I see a hand raised here in the middle.
So I manage, I've got a natural gas brokerage company. We manage about 1 billion cubic feet of gas per day. And so I want to share a commercial thing that's developing that should serve as a warning to you, I think, in a way. You've got gas that's priced at the wellhead and gas that's priced at the burner tip. And across the country, I would imagine that differential is about $4.
Sure.
We're expecting that the growth in data center demand will equal the expansion in liquefied natural gas export by 2030. So we're going to see data center demand grow by 12 BCF a day, export capacity double and go to 12 to 24 BCF a day. What we're working on right now with about 8 of our clients, our producer clients, is locating data centers in the production area where we have the lowest price cost of gas, because it's a lot cheaper to get a fiber optic cable to that production area. The presumption that I see in so many of these models is that wellhead gas will eventually make it to the marketplace, to the downstream data center that's located in a metropolitan area. It's not going to.
It's going to be consumed there.
It's going to be
on site.
consumed, the market is going to be created in the production area just for the simple economics of it. And so our company is working on these small distributed, I call them distributed generation data centers in the production area. I don't think any of your models take that in consideration. And I think that's going to exacerbate, if you could expand on the spinning reserve issue, wind versus solar, and then layer in the investor-owned utilities who are not investing in infrastructure because they've taken a net zero pledge.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're on to something. I think there's a train wreck coming, and I think it's going to happen it's going to happen sooner than people realize.
Yeah.
So again, I thank you for your presentation, but there are some inherent problems that I don't think people see yet.
That's fair, and very good point. I'll check with the team on this assumption that you indicate about the gas. I mean, we do look at the data center growth, and I would say likely we have it underrepresented the level of growth, because again, we want to go to the facts. We don't speculate, we don't assume, so we're looking on what we see from a demand from the data centers that we're certain. The other issue that we see in that industry, there is a lot of double counting happening across the regions. The data center companies are good at shopping around. We do see some trends similar to what you talk about on this concept of co-located loads. So we see some data centers co-locating with generating units and assuming that because you do that, then there are not going to be energy or capacity issues. The issue is that you're always going to be connected. Even in examples like yours, I believe you probably will still be connected to the transmission system, given the size of these. Unless you're fully disconnected. If you're fully disconnected, then that's not a significant issue. The gas won't get to us, which we'll look into that. But on these co-located loads, they're not going to be disconnected from the system. And I cannot imagine, because they wouldn't want to take that risk. So at any point in time, those loads, even if you have co-located with a generation unit, might show up in the system, and we need to plan for that. For those, even if it is 1 hour, 2 hours a year, that a load that large connects to the system needs to be there, and you need to plan for it. So I would say that's the other piece that we pay attention, is when people talk about co-located data center with a generation, that we solve the issue. That's easier said than done. But I take your point about the gas not being available because it's being consumed on site. That's a good point for us to, I'll take it back to my technical team and see if we've explored that. So thank you.
When your report came out a little while ago, I remember it was, I mean, you all are very measured. You've given a very measured, intelligent presentation. But I thought for the first time that it seemed fairly almost, it raised the alarm. Are you finding that you're gaining traction with calling carefully managed generator deactivations? Are there plans to maybe slow some of that, those early retirements?
We do see some efforts. I would say they are more specific to companies that are reassessing their plans. We keep seeing some new announcements. I just saw one in Indiana of a company that is going to delay a coal retirement. I live in Michigan. I see Michigan working to reactivate a nuclear power plant that had been retired in Michigan. So we see, I wouldn't say anything that is on a coordinated or planned basis, but we do see many examples of utilities or states that are trying to work this issue. What we will want to see is that assessment happen earlier on in the assessment phase of whether you retire a generator or not. And I think the equation is changing dramatically also with the demand growth that we see with the data centers. That is really, again, I'm telling you, I work at a utility before I joined NERC. Back in early 2023, when we started seeing this significant demand growth from data centers. So I'm talking about 2 years ago, we were not seeing this demand growth. So I think now that utilities, planning coordinators, RTOs are beginning to get better handle on how large this is and the impact of the generator deactivations with the queue that you have that is mainly renewables, you begin to see some actions taken. I wouldn't say that it's on a coordinated basis, but you do see some companies, some states beginning to take action in this space. And I do agree with your assessment that we are trying to point to the issue a bit more sharply than in the past, because, I mean, we continue to see the maps, and the maps every year are the same. We see momentum in some areas, but it's not to the level that we want to see. And I will call out the element that was raised is the level of infrastructure investment is, we had a chart I didn't show it, the pipeline investment has been de minimis over the last 3 years, and that worries us. So transmission seems to be picking up, but there is a lot of issues with siting. But yeah, we do see some momentum on the activations. I do see perhaps more emphasis on the transmission side of the house at this stage. Sorry, the side note I would say also, we did a big study that we also released back in November of last year. We did a new study that looked at interregional transfer capability. That was a Congress request that 3 years ago they wanted us to see. The question was, should we have a minimum transfer capability between regions? Should we set that at 30%, that each region should be able to export 30%? So they asked us to look into the details, and we realized that artificial number won't work. There are some regions that do need a lot more transfer capability. Texas was one that came in our list, New York, some areas of PJM, but you cannot have, but the point is that transmission and transfer capability is one area that we see the need, as well as natural gas infrastructure.
Well, I got a whole bunch of questions for
Sure.
you. So first of all, what about public education? How does this report get to the public? My fear is, of course, that if people don't understand the challenges that are going to face them, they continue to accept whatever legislators choose, or their grid provider chooses, or whatever the case might be. How is there a mechanism you have internally to ensure that this report gets to the general public somehow?
So we communications reports to me. So one of the things that we do, we hold a media webinar when we issue the report, and we've seen over time that we are capturing more general publication media companies. But I would say we still have work to do. I mean, given what I mentioned that 5 years ago our map was blue, we didn't have to do some of that. So that's one of the pieces that we're working through internally to figure out how much can we step up our efforts in the public education campaign of the importance of reliability, how we need to invest in reliability to ensure that we all get the power that we need, especially today we depend so much on electricity that we did 5, 10 years ago, many of us working remotely. The case. So that's an area that we're working through, partnering with different agencies like FERC to see what we could do. But we have started. We do get out more to the general public, but we still have ways to go, I would say. And so any ideas that you might have, welcome to take those, because again, as I indicated, we're an engineer organization. We're not designed to be talking to the general public. So part of the challenge is translating what can be dense and difficult to something that will be meaningful to our average customer is something that we need to work on.
Yeah, certainly my fear would be that the media wouldn't view this as the narrative they would like to carry forward today, that maybe you're a little bit Chicken Little and the sky is falling and you shouldn't be standing in the way of renewables penetration.
We get that. I mean, but we get the variety of messages. I mean, some we do get that hey, you keep saying every year there's going to be a big issue and nothing happens, so why should we pay attention? But we do see some of the serious media companies really paying attention, and we got good distribution from the last report, but as I indicated, more needs to be done, I believe, and we believe in this space.
That's good to hear. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the spinning inertia concept.
Sure.
Of course, you showed most of the additions are going to be solar. That feels a little bit like the cart before the horse, given we don't have inverters that are frequency forming, wave forming yet. Is there a crossover point on a particular grid where the percentage of spinning inertia gets to be so low that we have frequency issues on the grid? Is there a X on a crossover point there?
And that's an excellent point. Actually, that's one, I don't have an answer, bottom line, to your specific question, but one of the pieces that we want to do, so we feel this long-term reliability assessment is a critical tool for us to communicate. And we want to add more features to that long-term reliability assessment. So our team that is working here, that's one of the features that they want to add is assess the ability of each of the regions to provide for those essential reliability services. So we'll be able to answer the question that you're asking. We don't have the data, but we're getting to there to say, hey, yeah, we have issues in MISO in 27. We won't have enough frequency services being provided by the grid, so we'll be able to call those out. Today, we get a sense that we're going to have some of those issues, but we haven't been able to build we haven't built the models to get to that specific, but we're working on that. That's in our features of how we want to enhance our long-term reliability assessment. This year, usually we will look just at capacity, the way that the planning regions, just the 1 in 10, we'll look at the reserve margins. This year, we started adding some probabilistic assessments to look at the energy availability, getting back to the duration and magnitude. So we're adding more elements. We're also wanting to assess and better understand the gas system and how weather or other dynamics in the gas system could impact the electric system. So those are additional features that we're planning to add to our long-term reliability assessment over the next 3 years to get to questions like yours. But for now, the key is that the point that you made, it's more than just energy and capacity. There is a whole suite of other elements that come with the electricity grid that most of us don't have a good sense for it.
Last question. I'm sure there's probably other people who have questions too, but I'm curious, do you mail the report to government officials? So
Yes.
you were talking about the East Coast, for example. I think there's no willingness to build a new gas pipeline into New York, for example. And so we have a state on the East Coast that is unwilling to have new infrastructure built into it, and yet you highlight a very significant problem there that gas would contribute extra gas would contribute significantly to.
Yeah, no, we do. So a couple pieces that we do. We do engage closely, at least through my team, first with NERC, which is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, where especially for integrated states, they have a lot of power in determining where you go. Think of Georgia, for example. But even states that are deregulated, they can influence. So we talk to them through the association. We work very closely with the NACIO, the National Association of State Energy Offices. We go to the National Governors Association. We go talk to all of those. I mean, definitely some regions, for different reasons, they're going to choose different policy options. So we say, well, but these are some other policy options that you need to consider. It would be transmission build out. Or we say at some point during certain days of the year, you're going to need to rely on gas, diesel, I mean, probably better gas than diesel, so why don't you think about it? So we engage in those conversations. Again, different regions have different appetites, different needs, but that's a key element of our outreach, and I manage all of our outreach efforts, is talking to the national associations. And then our regional entities are really stepping up the efforts and talking directly to each of the states. So here we have someone that will be talking to the State Regulatory Commission, to the governor's office, to the legislature, an energy office. So that's part of our plans, is really step up the game in our outreach, not only at NERC, but through our regional entities. But ultimately, some will have different, have their points of view, but what we can do is inform them and bring the data so they have that as part of their discussion. We also talk to the consumer advocates in each region, because they can be important elements, especially in the energy regulatory proceedings. They tend to have a strong voice, or industrial customers is another group that we tend to engage quite a bit as well.
So when you think about reliability of, say if you take a gigawatt of natural gas reliability, what's the equivalent gigawatt of required, say, wind or solar to reach the same level of reliability?
So solar, usually you don't get more than 15, 20%, depending on the state. I mean, if you're in Arizona, you might get more 20, even a little bit higher. But I live in Michigan, there is a lot of solar, but there I don't think we assume more than 15% capacity factor. That means that out of 100% hours of the day of the year, you might have 15% of the hours produced in solar. Wind, you do get more into the 30%. Offshore wind, you might be getting into the 40, close to 50%, depending on where you set it up, how you set it up. So the point is that you do need a lot more wind and solar to compensate for some of the base load. But the other piece, and this is where I will come back, is, I mean, solar doesn't produce at night, but there are days of the year that even if you have a lot of solar or a lot of wind in the system, they just won't produce because there is no wind, there is no sun that particular day. Even if you have the solar panels ready to go, that you cannot consume it. When you had a system that you relied on coal, gas, you control when those units will be in and out. I mean, unless there is an unforeseen outage, but those even followed certain patterns that you could plan for. You knew that any given year you were going to have a number of forced outages, and you could plan for it. But wind and solar, not only you need more of them, but in certain days you're not going to have enough production, even if they are fully operational. But yeah, usually solar, 15 to 20. Wind, you might get more in the 30s, all the way to 40, 45% for offshore wind. That's where you see some emphasis on offshore wind, because it does have a bit better capacity factor. I won't get into the economics of any of those. That's not our role. But from a technical, you need a lot more of all of those. Yep, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very informative. My question would be, on one of your slides, you show, the charts start with, wind, solar, and wind is predominant source of generate electricity currently, and that's really scaring me. We, as United States, we sit on a giant, enormous amount of gas, and it's be much more reliable compared to solar or wind. So my question would be, what step need to be taken or involved for that chart to be flipped to be, natural gas will be, the dominant source of electricity. So a lot of us here in the room as producer or, supporter of producers, we need something to act on. I'm sitting here, I'm seeing the future is not so bright, but I still fuzzy about what can I do to change that picture, to reduce the risk.
Yeah, no, that's an important question. Ultimately, there are policy choices that are made at the state, at the regional, at the federal level. What we do at NERC is inform those. Again, ultimately, we don't weigh in whether gas or wind or solar is the right way. What we're pointing out is, given the information that we have, the data that's announced retirements, announced additions, we have an issue. How different policymakers decide to change the equation, whether they want to emphasize more gas, whether they want to delay retirements, whether they want to build more transmission. Some states might want to figure out a way to manage demand more carefully. There are multiple policy lever tools. I mean, that's up to policymakers that are usually elected officials and the public in general. What we can do is inform and indicate, hey, given the trends that we see with the data that we see, this is what could happen. This is the tools that you have at your disposal, and work your processes. Again, we're not going to weigh in on one versus the other. That's for policymakers. What we can do, to some of the earlier questions, and what we're trying to do is step up our outreach efforts, and really that's one of the reasons I joined the company. Engage more of the state officials, the companies, the industries, so you all understand, like members of this audience, what's happening. You all have different dialogues that are happening. You can inform, you can ask people to come talk to us. Hopefully by using the data, we can get to better decisions. But ultimately, each state and at different levels of policy making, different decisions will be made. What we can do is inform it with this data on what could happen if we continue with this trend.
The Environmental Protection Agency has regulations in place that very much discourage new gas-fired generation. Do you anticipate that there would be any change in the huge percentage of new solar generation if the environmental emissions regulations changed?
Yeah, that's where we try to be careful. We usually don't get into assessing policy impacts, even for like things like what you mentioned, what the EPA is doing. What we do see is, again, how companies are reacting to the impact of some of those. So as companies look at some of those actions by EPA or state regulatory mandates, they begin to make announcements. Hey, because of this, I'm going to retire X. I work at utilities. When we evaluated an EPA action, then we might work with our state regulatory agencies and say, hey, we're going to retire this coal plant because we're not going to make the investment. It's going to be too large of an investment. So we capture the data as the companies make those decisions. We don't get into the, well, if EPA puts this, I know some members of stakeholders will want us to do that. We've done it in the past, but in a very, very limited basis. What we do also is we do engage with EPA frequently. We share with them the data that we have. They will call us as they are contemplating new rules. We share the data that we have to inform how they take it or not. That's for EPA to share with you. But we do engage with EPA. Actually, we have a meeting tomorrow with them to explain the long-term reliability assessment and with the DOE. So we do that, but we don't really get into assessing policy. We're very careful about keeping our independence, objectivity. Once you start assessing policy implication of that or whatever other policy is something that we guard against. But we do engage with them, and we pick up actions by the companies because the companies ultimately are the ones that make the decision of whether they want to keep it or not, or whether they want to retire early or not. So we pick up that data working with the companies and using that data to inform the assessment.
It got me here.
Yeah.
You spoke earlier about the energy sources, of which solar is a significant part.
Yeah.
What kind of risk assessment do you do on massive changes for the demand for these various energy sources? For example, if you look at the data center providers, up to 6 months ago, everything was going to be net zero. If you look at, for example, a deal done in December, Meta in Northeast Louisiana is going to put a 2.3 gigawatt data center, which is going to be fired by natural gas. 6 months, a year ago, that was probably going to be net zero solar. So that's going to have a massive impact on the graph and the projections, which are going to have a massive impact on how you're going to plan going forward. So just looking at what kind of risk assessment do you do for that?
Yeah, so what we do is we first capture data of what's announced and that is firm. So something like what you indicated probably still wouldn't make our category because there's a lot of press releases that companies make that never may see the light of day. So, but once a project advances further into the development phases and they have a tier 1 sign agreement or is a processing agreement to connect to the system, then we'll begin to capture. So in that case, if indeed that happens, at some point it would show up here in our blue lines. We do then, based on that information of what we can count, and again, we want to be clear because there is a lot of announcements, we count on what we know, then we test the system under different parameters and see, is the system going to be able to operate the way that we want to, given these new additions, the retirements that we shared before, and the demand growth, and we test it under very different weather patterns. And that's where it begins to show the risk that we see. So if the trend that you indicated is true, that a lot of the yellow is going to become blue, we'll test it through our system against weather and other trends, and perhaps that's going to help. But ultimately, it's the combination of additions, retirements, demand against the weather that determines whether we have issues or not. So, but now something like what you indicated wouldn't make it because it's too speculative for us to count on it.
I guess in addition to that would be, in order to accelerate these data centers, a lot of the generation will not be connected into the system. So we'll take gas out of the system, but it will not be connected into the system because you can accelerate the development of the power system if you don't connect it into the system, so it'll be standalone. So that will take gas out of the system.
That's if they are truly independent from the system, that's something that we would need to account, and but I will venture to say that that's unlikely. I don't see a large load at that scale not wanting to be connected to the system. because otherwise they need to build all the redundancy that we have built into the electric system on their own. And that's very, very, very expensive. So most of these will likely still have a connection point to the grid. And once you have a connection point to the grid, we are providing services to that load, and that needs to be accounted. First, they need to abide by our standards, and second, they are going at some point, that generation is going to fail. I mean, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And the grid is going to have to show up to support it. If they are truly, truly independent, yes, that could be an issue that we need to account for, but I'm very unlikely that any large load of that magnitude is not wanting to connect to the grid because of the gigantic grid that we have provides services that are very, very reasonably priced, especially as we're talking about voltage and frequency. There is no price for that. That's just provided, and anybody connected to the grid is using that to mitigate their frequency and on voltage. So, but it's fair. If indeed you see a trend to truly independent loads that are taking generation off the grid, we'll need to account for that, but we haven't seen that yet on a more formal basis beyond some announcements.
I know we're, I know we're just past 9 o'clock. If you need to leave, feel free, but I know we've got a few more questions that we want to get to, but don't feel bad if you do need to step out.
I freed up the whole day thinking
Thank
that
you.
we'll
Yeah.
have a great session, so I'm good. I appreciate the questions and the feedback. I learned by the questions you asked. I learned a lot.
There you go. It seems like you provide a lot of information to the regulators and the governmental agencies, et cetera, which feels a little bit like a one-way sharing of that data, and maybe that's your mandate, I'm not sure. In terms of sharing the exact same data to industry and advocacy would seem to be an appropriate measure to provide tension to that data such that there could be two views of that data, and the advocacy industry could opine and weigh in on that to counterbalance whatever agendas may be being followed by the governments. Do you interact with advocacy industry people and provide them with a fair look at the same data and your recommendations?
Yeah. Going back to the point, we are a truly stakeholder-driven organization, so we engage with all manners of industry stakeholders. So a couple of pieces. One is the way we're set up. For example, I indicated that we're independent. Our board is selected by something that we call a member representative committee. So this is formed of people from the industry. So you have investor-owned, rural co-ops, public power. We have RTOs. We have industrial customers, consumer advocates. First, and they review everything that we do, and they advise our board. So first, we have a very strong, and they select our board members. So the industry selects our board members, not NERC alone goes and figures out. So we have the industry, so that's the first counterbalance. All the work that we do is based on committees. We have like 5 different committees that report to our board, and they are all staffed with industry members. But then one of the things that we're doing is trying to be sure that we add all the voices that we can to those industry groups. So one of my big efforts is working as closely as I can with industries that usually we don't work as closely with, the gas, oil industries, for example, but at the same time with the clean energy industry, to making sure that they have a voice in our processes. So now they are members of many of our committees. They are participating in our work. And then finally, I personally host quarterly what I call a Trades and Forum meeting in DC. So I invite probably 40 different organizations. And end of January, we're meeting to talk about this topic. So I have gas trades, I have the clean energy, obviously I have the traditional ones that we work with, the utility industries. We have the RTOs, the regulators, or at the table. And I'm telling you, we do get into spirit debates, and we hear voices from both ends. We try to stick to the facts, and that's what we are, fact-based, independent, look at data that we can count on. We inform policy, we don't set policy. But if, and I was talking to the table, I wanted to get more to the Marcellus Utica shale producers because we've been talking mainly to producers that are in the Gulf. So, and we know that some of the issues that we saw in the Winter Storm Elliott was more like in the Marcellus Utica shale. So by all means, if there is any other group that we need to be talking, let us know. We're talking to the data center companies. We're thinking of electric vehicles having an impact to the system. We're talking to the electric vehicle companies, distributed energy aggregators. We look at environment. I was talking to the NRDC. We presented this data to the NRDC. So I would say, having worked in the industry for 20 years, the stakeholder process that we have at NERC is very, very robust. We're trying to expand it and enhance it, but it is pretty strong. And again, as I indicate, any of the standards that we do has to be passed by the industry. Very few occasions, we just started doing that where the board is taking action directly. So, but any other groups that you have, or as you go through your travels, please send them our way. We're more than happy to engage with different groups. Sure.
So a couple of comments and then a question. So I think it's pretty clear with the growth in demand that we're seeing here that the right answer is we need all forms of new energy to come on the grid. So the focus really needs to be an all of the above approach as opposed to advocating for one energy resource over the other. How do we grow the pie? We should be building any kind of energy project that makes economic sense. And all type of energy that we're seeing come online now, have many case studies that make economic sense. Secondly, the conversation that was happening over here around, that how do you sort of compare, or how many new wind and solar farms do you need to counteract or to provide the same reliability benefits as a natural gas plant or some other, baseload type of plant? I think that supports the case for interregional transmission and expansion of the grid as a whole, because while wind may not be blowing in the middle of the country, it could be blowing out in California, or one region the sun is shining, and the other regions it's not. And so if you have an interconnected national grid system, then you can import that wind energy from one part of the country or that solar energy from one part of the country to another. And so that changes the dynamic of that conversation. But my question is around, the report clearly focuses a lot on the growing place of natural gas in serving our baseload needs across the entire system. What are the assumptions around nuclear? That's been sort of absent from this conversation. What are the assumptions in the report? And then what are sort of NERC's views in general, in particular around, the SMR technology?
Yeah, I don't think we have anything assumed for nuclear, again, in the next 10 years. And so our point of view is we do need large-scale solutions to help us address. So, and I agree with your point, as you look at our recommendations, we're kind of multiple tools need to be deployed to manage through the challenges that we see. Nuclear, carbon capture, hydrogen, you name it, could be good, but we need those solutions to be at scale. We need gigawatt solutions, couple of gigawatts. I mean, we talk about 100 gigawatts of generation retiring. So we need things at scale, but unfortunately, some of these are not happening in the next 3, 5, 10 years, and that's where we already see issues. So in the meantime, that's why I think we're emphasizing so much the gas, because when we see the data, we don't see nuclear yet playing a role in the next 10 years. We don't see carbon capture or hydrogen. So without any of those other tools, we're left with gas. I agree with you. With transmission, we still need old form, potentially delaying retirements, as we indicated. Hopefully, they turn into be great tools that we can use at our disposal. But in the next 10 years, none of those we see playing at scale, at the scale that we need.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Camilo, for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you who were able to stick around. Obviously, with Chris being away, he was really a magnet for high-quality speakers. So the extent that you have suggestions for us, we want to continue this on a quarterly basis and certainly open to that feedback. So again, thank you for being here on on short notice. Enjoy your day.